Hello and welcome to Beyond Binary Thinking. I'm going to share with you a conversation I just had with Paul Field and Gabriel MacArthur. They are very interested in community and having lovely conversations where they reach across the aisle and understand people with differing opinions. So, to that end, I'd like to ask for some support to our listeners of the podcast. If you could please reach out to anyone you think would be an interesting guest with a different perspective that you'd recommend we have on, please reach out to them and ask them to come join us, because it'd be really good to keep having more interesting, wonderful guests to have thoughtful conversations with. Thank you so
It
much.
was plus Dutch for cheers.
And that is, it's the connection. That's all teaching is. You have to make a connection to that student. Most of what students end up leaving the classroom with is communication skills or critical thinking skills, or kind of like we're gathering here today to learn to talk to people that don't maybe see the world the same way you do. Nobody remembers the finer details of early Cold War America, really.
Right.
So it's like, making the connection is really where it's at. And so, like I said, I lucked into this position. It's a good fit for me because this is a mill town, and so it's kind of, sometimes it feels a little bipolar around here as far as politically speaking, because it's a huge union town, but there's also a huge staunchly conservative section. So it's like, they don't see a contradiction there at all. But those are the and then there's a ton of poverty because most of the mills have moved on. So it's a really high poverty area. And these, like I tell my students, these are my people. I grew up poor in a wealthy area of the country, but we were poor. For whatever reason, I speak the language, I guess. So,
Yeah.
I mean, for all intents and purposes, I still am poor. It's not like public school teachers are raking it in. I keep hearing that rumor, but
yeah. What's weird to me is I've started to hear that peak up too. Like we're overpaying our teachers, but the common knowledge from everything I can remember is the teachers were always underpaid.
well, I mean, it came into stark relief because I did a lot of other things in my life, trying this and trying that. I went to Marine Corps right out of high school, and then when I came out of the Marine Corps, I didn't have a plan B, which was not a good deal. I was just trying to make ends meet. So I've tried a little bit of everything in my life and had my share of being the top guy for a month here and there, and then I had my share of grinding it out like everybody else. But this is my 8th year teaching in this district, and this is the first year I'm making almost as much as I made as a first year car salesman in 1996.
Oh wow.
So for me, it's kind of like our society has a real love-hate relationship with education. There's a lot of words expended about how valuable it is, but not much actual value attached to it, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. What's been striking to me over the course of this pandemic is whether I'm listening to liberal news or conservative news, one of the common themes I hear about kids going back to school is it's so harmful to their development, which I'm sure it is. You don't want kids sitting in a room all day by themselves looking at a computer screen, but it's almost like that's a cover for I don't want these kids in here while I'm trying to work. That's really what it sounds like to me.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, learn how to manage your kids while you're working. What do you want me to say?
Yeah. I get kids at that magic hour when they're right on the cusp between, they're still kids, but they're trying to learn how to be an adult. And, so I have to speak their language. So memes, I guess, is where I'm going with this. I get flooded with memes. I use memes way more often than I ever thought that I would use memes. But despite that, here in our community, we've enjoyed pretty good support from our community when the cards are on the table. Like when every couple of years when we go to the community for the next round of bonds and levies and things, they generally support us. But there is a large, vocal, very active, very loud segment of anti-public education people around here, and they don't ever miss an opportunity to attack us. And most of them, they type out these furious manifestos in barely literate sentences. You could barely read it, just ranting and raving about how we're all a bunch of hardcore leftist infiltrators that are indoctrinating their kids and tearing down America, and I mean, the list goes on. And it's like, it's a well-funded movement. I used to wonder, well, where does all that come from? And then somebody made a comment once, we were talking about it, and they're like, look, the thing to get used to is everybody at some point in their life in America sat in a classroom. Even if it was 45, 50 years ago, they sat in a classroom. And so everybody believes they're an expert on education because they were in a classroom that one time. And it's true, it was kind of an aha moment. I was like, oh yeah, now I get it. But I mean, it's well funded. We're, unions, teachers unions are one of the last strong unions, and it's not from lack of trying. On average, I get a dozen flyers a month sent to my house, reminding me that I don't have to pay union dues and don't let the union tell me what to do. And, it's a very well-funded effort. And it's like, hey, the reason I can go and stand in front of my classroom and put edgy, because that's the classes I teach. We deal with the big questions, the controversial stuff all day long. And the reason I can put things out in front of my students and not have to worry about being fired by the end of the day is because of the union and the protection that it affords. And if that costs me $80 a month, then it's money well spent, as far as I'm concerned. But
well, I mean, I think that all kind of ties into sort of what we're talking about today is, the inverse of it, I guess, is so many people are being pitched against each other, like getting adversarial towards unions, and without really understanding the whole argument is false. The whole the whole battle is made up conflict that I think that's we're such a victim of that in America. There's so many unnecessary conflicts.
Well, you're absolutely right. We manufacture, or we allow conflicts to be manufactured out of thin air. And we all have theories. I'm certain that we'll probably get into some of that today about why, but why we keep falling for the same old routine every 4 years, for instance. Why do we keep? It's starting to feel like we're the rubes in some sort of weird carnival. We're certain that we can get that basketball through that hoop and win that big prize. But that hoop is a 1/4 inch less in diameter than that basketball, so it's never gonna happen.
By sheer luck, one person manages to get it through that hoop, and we all look at that and go, "Oh, well, we can do it."
We can. The old saying that most poor people in America view themselves as temporarily inconvenienced millionaires. It's absolutely true. It's like getting people to act. You would think that getting people to act in their own best interest would not be this hard. But it is. That flares up a lot in the education environment. It begins with this myth that education is some monolithic institution. 5 or 6 school districts in this county, none of which bear much resemblance to any of the other school districts if you walked into a classroom on any given day.
Right.
And that's just in one small county that shares a lot of demographic overlap. And so that for somehow people think, hey, public schools coast to coast, they're all on the same program and they all come from the same place with their, ideological leanings and everything. Oh, it's like, it's absurd. You shouldn't even have to argue against it. It's so absurd.
Yeah.
But people are convinced of it, and there's been a lot of money spent to convince people of it. And um, it mystifies me sometimes. It's like, I mean, I don't know. I grew up in a very conservative environment. I mean, I grew up in a little town called Angwin, California. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Most people 20 miles away have never heard of it.
No.
It's in the upper Napa Valley. So, even
okay.
though in the 70s, the wine industry was just getting off the ground and, it was much more agricultural. I grew up around working cowboys and guys that literally punch cattle for a living and kind of a mixture. And then there were, even by those days standards, wealthy vineyard owners and everybody in between and thousands of migrant workers. And so it was a huge mix, but I grew up in this little town that was predominantly white. There was a college there that was ran by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I don't know if you know anything. I was raised Seventh-day Adventist. I didn't stick with it, but that's how I was raised. And anyway,
Right.
if you know anything about Seventh-day Adventists, it's a very conservative religion. I mean, we weren't allowed to go to movie theaters. Never mind, any sort of music concerts or anything else that weren't directly religious in nature, and all these
Right.
different things. And I went to Seventh Adventist schools, first grade through 12th grade, and it was all very, very conservative in nature, but everybody valued education. Like, education was a virtue. We revered our teacher, like we were those typical kids. If you saw your teacher at the store and they talked to you for 5 minutes, it was the high point of your day, and, and somewhere along the way that all went off the tracks. And typically speaking, there's this perception, and I don't necessarily think it's true, but it's definitely a widespread perception that conservatives are not fans of education, and people on the liberal side of the spectrum are fans of education, and therefore educational institutes are all controlled by liberals. And it's like, I don't know where this comes from, but
Well,
there it is.
as far as colleges, I don't really I hear that more about colleges, that it's a liberal conspiracy to indoctrinate our children, and
Yeah.
I wish I could just grab a lot of these celebrity philosopher types, and just tell them it's just this simple. If you live in a small town and you go to a college in a big city, there's going to be a lot of other people there that are from different backgrounds than you, and you're going to inevitably get to know them. And
Right.
it's going to expand your view of the world. It's really that simple. But they think it's, and yeah, of course, there are some professors that have a more liberal bent or a more conservative bent or whatever the case is, but it's not like they spend all their time with that one professor.
Right.
They're getting a wide range of views, and
Yeah.
they're forming their own.
Yeah, which is exactly the purpose
Yeah.
of education, and even higher education. I mean, I do tend to think, you're right. There's probably at least there's definitely a perception that, like, for instance, high school is much more rigid and dogmatic, and then colleges and universities sort of become these free fire zones. But it's interesting to me, people have pointed that out in a variety of different backgrounds. They say, look, a lot of people, they grow up and they never leave a 50-mile radius from where they were born. a staggering percentage of Americans never get further than 100 miles from their birthplace. So you hit it right on the head. Of course, they go off to university, and now all of a sudden there's, 2,000 or 3,000 or more people around them all day that come from all over the world, and they're, for the first time in their life, they're exposed to this wide range of ideas, and a lot of them dramatically change their worldview, like most reasonable human beings would do if you get new information. And so, and then somehow that becomes indoctrination.
Yeah, it's like, well, anybody who doesn't get outside of their bubble, of course, they're going to look at that as indoctrination, not realizing being in the bubble themselves is indoctrination.
Yeah. I mean, I had to go through that, to be honest with you. I don't sugarcoat it with my students either. I tell them, look, when I was a kid, I bought into it 100%. I was all about, if you want to use a cliche, I was all about God, country, and apple pie, right? And mom, and went off to the Marine Corps. And at that phase in my life, 10 days after I graduated high school, I shipped off to basic training. I didn't have a well-rounded worldview. I didn't even have I read a lot. We weren't allowed to watch a lot of TV, so I read, tons of books from a very young age, and anything I could get my hands on, I read. But so I don't think of myself as ignorant, but my worldview was very one-dimensional. Coming out of that conservative background where things were, you just accepted things as this is the truth.
Right.
And then, going off to the Marine Corps, which is also a rigid environment. And I came out of that with this distinct, I tell people, like, my worldview at one point felt like there wasn't any problem in the world that couldn't be solved with enough killing, like, got a problem with them over there, crush them, and now they're not a problem, right? And so I had to shed that over the years, and it took me a while. And I don't know if I don't know if it's fair to say that I've achieved any sort of enlightenment or anything else, but my worldview today versus my worldview 30 years ago, completely different.
Right. Well, it's a never-ending process if you're open to it, But what's interesting is, so I'm in Colorado and I've lived here my whole life, but when I was a kid, it was a pretty strongly red state, and probably over the past 8 years, I'd say it's become more of a blue state. It was probably purple towards the beginning of that, but so there's pockets of conservatism all over the place here, but a lot of influx of people from California and other places has changed the demographics somewhat.
The California invasion theory, yes.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is you get pushback on that from any end of the political spectrum, which I've never really understood it, but they say we're turning into California. That's their favorite thing to say.
Well,
the housing prices are going up, but to me that's kind of a minor problem compared to growing our economy and our state.
Right. And it's that it's interesting because a lot of what we are discussing here, it stems from this almost pathological need and I don't think it's fair to say of Americans, certainly not of Americans alone, but since we are here in America, coming from the American perspective, there's a pathological need to reduce everything to the most simplistic terms possible, and then go with the easiest answer.
Well, tying it into what you were saying earlier, it's like a meme is the most efficient form of communication, right? So, as you say, it's not a unique problem to America, but simple ideas transmit quicker, right? The truth is more nuanced, and you have to have a deeper understanding, and that's often lost in a quick soundbite that we get from a 24-hour news cycle or Twitter or social media in general.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That simple idea spreads very quickly because it takes very little effort to adopt it. You look at it, you think, oh, that sounds good to me, and that becomes part of your worldview. This simplistic idea that the only reason, for instance, Colorado's, ideological demographics are changing is because floods of invaders from California came there with an agenda and ruined it for everybody else. I went through that when I came up to Portland in 2001. It was almost confrontational to say I'm from California. People still to this day, and I can go outside my house now and walk 3 blocks in any direction, and I guarantee I will find more than one, anti-California bumper sticker.
Right.
So California has become this, in some people's minds, this giant Death Star that's slowly creeping out and destroying the rest of the country with their crazy ideas. And some of it, like everything else, has a ring of truth. There are plenty of people with money, primarily from coming out of places like Silicon Valley and Hollywood and other sort of extreme wealth generating geographical areas, and they go to somewhere else and they want to make that new place just like the place they just left.
Right.
And so some of the critique, I think, is warranted, but the idea that people only change their political views because of some specific agenda that's being applied to them, I think is part of why we're having such a rough time with political discourse in this country right now.
Yeah, and people do grow and change, as you said. I think one of my favorite quotes for that is, if you don't look back on yourself from 10 years ago and cringe at some of the things you thought or said, then you haven't grown as a person, really, right? It's probably a good thing that you...
Oh, I agree. And it's easier to tell yourself that the Californians are invading than, oh, my kid might be pretty liberal.
Right. Yeah, that education I got myself $60,000 in debt for is forever telling him against my politics. Damn.
Yeah. That's I think, again, a lot of it has to do with, you're absolutely right. Self-reflection, it's hard. And some people...
And circumstances change as well, right? Like, I've had a really interesting theory that if you look at Thatcher and Reagan, at that time, right, there was a lot less old people than we have now. So it absolutely made sense to gut the social security safety net, because it was money going for, like, well, who's using all these services? Like, we have a bunch of young people, a booming economy. Now's time to double down on that growth, right? And then the situation changes, where now obviously you have an aging population, a health problem, and so things change and the situation changes. So there's this idea that, as you say, it's not necessarily that that you can't have one solution for every problem. Like you said, when you're in the army, and to the man with a gun, every...
and there's that old saying, when your only tool is a hammer, every problem is a nail. That's a lot of what fuels this sort of socio-political rage, if you want to call it that, in America right now, is that people are not equipped with a variety of tools to confront complex issues. They have one tool, and that's all they're able to use.
Smash like.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear both of your perspectives on whether, like, how much has America changed? So do you think, like the politics are shifting? Do you like there's this idea that we're more divided than ever, but is that your experience, or do you just think that it feels that way because we all have social media and a racist uncle?
I think the visibility aspect of it is a big part. I couldn't say that we're more divided than ever when we had a civil war in the 1800s. That seems to me more divided than ever. The social media's aspect to amplify this problem. If there's a shooting, within 10 seconds, the whole country knows about it, and they might not understand. Well, shootings altogether have gone down over the past 20 years. They just see that and automatically think, well, it's starting to rise again.
I would agree, and I think this perception, at least, is amplified. I mean, as a historian, if I can claim that lofty title, I don't know, but we have always been very contentious as a nation, politically and socially. We've been very good for much of our history at sort of sweeping it under the rug or reducing the idea that there's just a few malcontents out on the fringes of society and that most people are happy. But I think social media has, amongst other things, it's allowed people to construct these echo chambers. The way social media works is it swathes you in things that you like, and it exposes you to more and more things that you like and less things that you don't like. And so over a very brief period of time, everyone around you in social media seems to share your worldview. And so you become absolutely convinced that you're correct because, quote unquote, everybody thinks this. Yeah, everybody agrees with
every election ever, right? That both sides can't believe that their side didn't win because they're like, well, I checked my Facebook and everyone was agreeing with my side.
Everybody voted for him, or her. How could she possibly lose? And it was, it's like, well, there's a whole world out there that a mixture. And of course, the pandemic has just really inflamed this trend, but we were already doing it before. Our worlds are shrinking down to this bubble where there's this technological mediator between us and the real world, and there's this curator, if you will, that filters the information coming into our little bubble in a way that gives us a very skewed view of the world and what's going on in the world. If you don't make an effort to go out there and see for yourself, you become very convinced that your worldview is the worldview. And I think that's certainly inflamed our ability to have reasonable discourse, certainly in my lifetime. I was born when Lyndon Johnson was president. Obviously in my younger years, I wasn't paying much attention to anything that was going on. But, I think back on the tone and I think back on the discussions that were taking place, and, people are losing the ability to agree to disagree because everything has become a weaponized version of itself. Words have become weaponized, and people have adopted these, completely intolerant, inflexible situation or attitudes towards what they perceive as the enemy. Once upon a time, because somebody didn't agree with you politically didn't make them the enemy, and now that's the verbiage you see being used, and I think that's fueled by social media, creating these echo chambers. But I also think, we can't overlook the fact that we as a nation, we've been at war for basically 20 years, and I don't mean a series of loosely connected military events. This global war on terror that began on 2001 is still going on. And as a society, I think we've become much more militarized in terms of, it's leaked into every aspect. You watch commercials on TV and they're talking about pickup trucks that are military grade, and you get advertisements for, oh, you want to use this military grade flashlight, and that it's this sort of armed camp mentality that has seeped
scholarships
out.
for colleges, the computer
Yeah.
games people play.
Yeah.
You have a
Yeah.
lot of medics who have military experience. That's where they learn their trade, right? And a lot of police officers too.
I
Yeah.
can't help but think that the rise of drones, in recreational use, is almost a way to get us comfortable with drones in general.
Yeah. I mean, there is, that it's been pointed out by many, social commentators and authors and academics and people of all different backgrounds. The militarization of our police forces has reached what many people, myself included, feel like as a crisis proportion, because why does a civilian police force need mine resistant armored vehicles? Why does a civilian police force need head to toe body armor and high capacity weaponry? It doesn't seem to fit their mission or what they exist for, and that attitude has leaked over into our political discourse, and how people feel like our society should be structured, comes from that attitude.
Yeah, and as you said, to the man with the hammer, right? And if a police officer's going out tooled up for war, then that is what's more likely to happen.
Yeah.
You can see it, interestingly enough, you can see that a very similar, if you want to look back in time frames, the early Cold War years, the 1950s, that so-called golden age of America. There are so many parallels between now and then in terms of themes. This intense rise of nationalism, this intense sort of backlash against the concept of racial equality, and this feeling that we are somehow locked into an epic struggle for the existence of our nation, and you're either contributing to winning that struggle or you're the enemy and you're part of the problem. Those attitudes were very prevalent, especially in those early Cold War years. You could see, it's quite easy to see those themes kind of coming back around again.
Yeah. I mean, as a kid, I was fascinated with McCarthyism and how that could happen in America, and just the lengths that they went to. And, when I was studying it as a kid, it was really more just a curiosity about that time period. But growing up, watching it start to bubble up again, it's frustrating, because you almost wish that people knew that history a little more intimately so that they could be informed as these allegations start getting thrown around left and right.
Yeah, and it's been really disheartening hearing there's just such a simplistic take on Nazi Germans that they were bad and they were evil and everyone dressed in uniforms and acted the same. And aren't we glad that we're free and so different from them? And you're like, oh, you really missed the whole lesson of that history.
Yeah.
Because Germany was a very educated, cultured place. And the point of that is that the Germans aren't inherently evil. That evil sits within all people, and we always need to keep it in check.
It's just like people have never heard of the milligram experiment, or have, if they did hear about it once upon a time in school, they've forgotten all about it. Because that was literally his central thesis, was that Germans were somehow predisposed to authoritarian influences, and of course, as we know,
wasn't able to prove it.
Yeah, he had to abandon his entire project when it became obvious that that's a human trait. That is something that human beings should be on guard against at all times, and instead it seems like we go through these periods of time where there's sort of this convulsion of authoritarianism, and everybody embraces it as some sort of solution to what they feel is the problem in our society today.
Yeah, I'll be talking about this tomorrow with some guys from the Realpolitik podcast, which I'm a big fan of. But one of the things sort of I hear talking to them is that both the left and the right have this like desire for this strong leader who will make their side win and the other side lose. And I don't know, it goes to a dangerous place. On one level, I can say, like, from a Freudian psychological analysis, like, everyone is longing for mummy and daddy to come and fix it, right? But I do worry about the strong person politics. Although there's that old meme, right? Like, just calling everyone you disagree with Hitler.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a big misconception too. Is people seem to think that the right has a monopoly on authoritarianism, at least in America. But as in my experience, that's not true at all. I think there's a lot of authoritarian tendencies on the left, just as much as there are on the right.
Yeah, ban things, make things illegal, and yeah, we know the Twitter mobs acting like the Spanish Inquisition, hunting for wrong think and bad tweets.
I mean, one of the things that I've observed going to political meetings and, especially Democratic Party meetings is dissent is not tolerated whatsoever. And to the point to where I've seen people get violent with somebody who's shouting down a politician who's speaking, a Democrat who's speaking. And they're not coming at it from a right perspective. They're coming
in theory,
at it
a fellow Democrat, right?
Yeah, no, and that's exactly it. It's a typically a progressive, or socialist leaning who calls out the Democratic politician for something they were doing, and there's no tolerance for it whatsoever. I've seen somebody I know was at one of the meetings at it was their state convention. I can't remember the state, but she got hit by a guy with a cane because she was protesting the speaker. So I think that's each side, the right and the left, thinks that they're not capable of those tendencies. And I think that's partly contributing to the problem.
I can't speak to America. I'll let you go in a sec, Paul. Just a quick thought. I can't speak to America, but in Britain we find the Conservatives are much better at papering over those differences and cracks and becoming quite a broad church coalition. So if you look at Brexit, for example, which divided the British politics entirely, if you look at foreign policy, internationalist, hawks versus isolationists, if you look at religions, which don't play as big a factor in European politics, but are a case for some politicians, and even our current Prime Minister, who isn't particularly popular with most of the Conservatives, but they seem quite good at getting along anyway for tactical reasons. And I'm often dismayed watching the left just splinter and fracture for any reason.
Well, and this is sort of a big point with me. I've spoken to this a little bit in some of the writing that I do, and I've gotten an amazing amount of pushback from people that initially say, "Oh, we agree," and then they're like, "Oh, wait a minute, we didn't know that you really intended to try to be nonpartisan." They default to sort of these partisan positions.
Yeah, I get that a lot. People love my takedowns on the other side, and then when they find me taking down their side, they're like, "Hey, I thought we were on the same team," and I'm like, "Nah, I just call bullshit as I see it."
Yeah. It's interesting enough. I had some firsthand experience back. I was in grad school when the Occupy protests started to go on, and being in Portland, and I attended a very extremely liberal college for my grad program. They had a very good teachers prep program, but so I went down and I got involved directly in a lot of the Occupy protests that were going on in Portland at the time, and I very quickly became disillusioned because of this exact same thing. The people that were involved there, they weren't looking to create an open and free environment where exchanges of ideas were valued. They were simply looking to replace one dogma with another, and replace one group that they felt was pulling all the strings with their own preferred group that would then pull all the strings. And it got very ugly. I mean, people who and I don't even mean like openly dissented against some of the more popular views, but if you even called into question any of the views or ask simple questions like, well, how will this work in the real world, or how is this supposed to, you were turned on. And I witnessed a lot of very ugly incidents, and I kind of sparked a few of my own, by trying to ask more questions, and we're seeing it again now. One of the most, I think, naked examples, if you will, is this concept that any critique of Joe Biden or Kamala Harris is akin to treason, and you're, shut up and vote for what's best in this country. And the number of times that I've been told, you can't call into question their political record, and you can't say, how can I trust somebody to be in charge of sort of revamping our criminal justice system when they've both done so much to contribute to some of the worst elements of our criminal justice system. People turn on you. They don't want to hear it.
Gabriel, I can't imagine a better tee up for you to introduce sort of your experience and what you've been up to.
Right. I've always been politically interested. I've always followed politics, but it wasn't until Bernie Sanders came onto the scene that I thought, well, here's somebody who's saying a lot of the same things that I've been thinking for a long time, and I jumped in. Well, I had my own view of how politics worked. I thought you could at least have a basic discussion about politics. I know if you get into the weeds, it could get contentious, but I remember posting on social media, I would say mid 2015. So clearly a year before the primaries actually started getting kicked off. And I basically just posted, so I think I like this Bernie Sanders guy. So who are you leaning towards? And that was the vibe of the post. And right off the bat, people were screaming at me, you're going to end up getting Trump elected, and all this vile vitriol just from merely asking the question. And that kicked off my whole 2016 experience. And up until that point, I was like, well, I like this Bernie guy. But after that, I was like, okay, I need to get involved here and actually help this guy win, because this type of attitude that seems to be prevailing on that campaign, we can't let this win. And it's that chip on my shoulder slowly got larger and larger. And this narrative that Bernie bros are these raving lunatics who will challenge you at every turn, and they'll try to undermine you. It's almost like it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the more resentful we got, the harder we fought. Then there was the question towards the end of that journey, can the Democratic Party be reformed, or should we go off and start our own thing? And ultimately, I tried to go off and start something new. And what I found was there's a lot of people who think, yeah, the way that things are it sucks, but it's the way things are, and we're not going to change it. So you might as well just work with what you got. And over the past couple of years, the question just got even more muddled as Trump's behavior seemed to be more dangerous. And I guess my frustration with leftists is there's a difference between people who want to just enact their will and or get their viewpoint out there and be validated for it. And then there are leftists who actually want to change minds and convince people this is why these ideas would improve our country. So that argument in the left, I think, is the biggest reason for this fracturing. Is there's just a difference in tactics, a difference in goals. Some leftists just want to get a bunch of likes on social media, and that be that.
Yeah, as ContraPoint so beautifully says,
Yeah.
for all the people on Twitter talking about revolution, you wonder how many of them would actually start
Follow
target
through with it.
practice and sharpening the guillotines. And probably not
Right.
many, but they're LARPing, right?
I don't know about most other leftists, but I don't want to see bloodshed in the streets. I don't want to see violence. I want to, I want us to achieve our goals through the
Just want
democratic
healthcare,
process.
man. Just want healthcare.
Right. Yeah. And most people don't think about what happens the day after the revolution, because a lot of people who put those guillotines up in the French Revolution that people romanticize ended up underneath them eventually.
Well, so then I have a question for you, Gabriel, because this sort of resonates with my experience. Being in a high school, trying to get adolescents involved in civic life and the political discourse in our country, it's a hard task. It's a never-ending, sort of effort. But back in 2015 and 2016, the sort of energy that swept through my classrooms, and I realize this is very anecdotal, but this was what I'm seeing with my own eyes. Kids got excited about Bernie Sanders. They did, and it so happened that we held the caucuses at the school that year. There were lines mostly consisting of younger people in that 18 to 24 graphic, stretching down and around the building and out into the ball field. I mean, people stood in line for hours to get into a room to caucus and to exchange ideas. And I, as an educator, I got excited about that. I said, look, this is what we need. This is going to be a defining moment. But then, and Bernie Sanders repeatedly said that he was going to take his fight for the nomination onto the convention floor. But then he didn't do that. And I'm going to use sort of the observations that many of my students made, as they sort of dejectedly dropped their Bernie pens in the trash bin and trudged home. In their eyes, he sold out. He basically got on board with the machine and gave his little speech at the convention about how we all need to be unified. And that destroyed a lot of younger people's view of the system. They felt like he was just sort of sucked up into the machine, and I'm not saying it's a valid view, but I'm saying that's the view they had, and it's hard to get that back. Many of those same kids today, they're ardently, they're either open about I don't intend to vote, or I'm going to vote for Jill Jorgensen because I'll never vote for a major party candidate again, and they have all sorts of different views, but it definitely was a moment that felt like, okay, what happened to the fire? So I guess my question.
I think for a lot of people, Bernie Sanders' campaign represented the possibility that we could win the argument through democratic means, right? So what I mean by that is, instead of what the paradigm we've been experiencing for a long time, the Democrats blame everything on the Republicans blame everything on the Democrats. Here was a campaign that represented a vision, a specific set of policy changes that we could work together towards. It isn't about blame, it's about moving forward. And when that fell apart, I think a lot of people realized, oh, well, I guess that whole adversarial paradigm ultimately won out, and it's just going to circle the drain even further. And I can't speak to everybody, but at least that's how I've been feeling about the situation. Is not to be dramatic, but that was kind of a lot of people view that as our last shot at a civil way to move forward as a country.
Just as an outsider, it did smack me as incredible after, and I think some Europeans aren't aware how unpopular Hillary Clinton is, or how much of an establishment candidate she was seen as. But yeah, after losing to Donald Trump, the Democrat Party decided to double down and be like, anyone else who was more establishment than Hillary Clinton, who can we find?
And that's definitely, I mean, that's hitting the nail on the head with a lot of the sentiment that I see and hear back from people. It's like, wow, talk about saying, well, this didn't work at all in 2016, so we're going to do twice as much of it. And this time it'll work. This time we'll be able to shame enough people into supporting our candidate that it'll work out for us. The truth of the matter is, there really isn't, and I've taken a tremendous amount of criticism, and probably some of it is well deserved. I don't see much of a difference when it comes right down to where the policy meets the people in presidential administrations in my lifetime. Without picking on anybody specifically, the working class in America, our situation has gone one direction and one direction only since 1970, and that is downward or ever more precarious.
I mean, I've been looking at the stats on it, and it's funny because people still talk about millennials like they're children, but they're 30 years old now, right? But they still feel like children because a lot of them are having to live with their parents or in very cheap rented accommodation. If you look, I think the typical boomer, sorry for the pejorative term, but I think we all know what the generation I'm referring to. I think they had 4 times more money than a millennial when you account for that's the way the economy's gone. It's like a quartered for people.
There's still this desire to sell the idea of the American dream to people that can't afford to buy that idea. You're absolutely correct. Working class wages have remained stagnant since 1970. While executive level salaries have increased nearly 1,000-fold, and shareholder value now has become sort of this economic virtue that no company wants to set aside in favor of their workers, and this has happened across both. Tying it back into the idea of a political party. Both parties have contributed to this trend. And so I think a lot of Generation Z, the people that I spend a lot of time around, they can't quite define why they're angry, but they know they're angry because their parents have struggled their whole lives. I think it was Howard Zinn who once famously said, look, they tell you that in America, if you work hard enough, you can become wealthy. Well, we know this is a lie because we see people work hard their whole lives and they're never wealthy. It's not a direct quote, but he said words to those effect. And I think, Generation Z is sort of checking out. They're just saying, look, we're not going to play that game. And my experience with them is a lot of them are fully prepared to let it all burn down before they participate in a game that they see as completely rigged.
Well, I can tell you, where my anger comes from is, I came of age right at the height of the crash, the 2009 financial crisis. And not only that, but I was also becoming a father at the same time, fresh out of high school, and trying to find a job. I was competing with people who had bachelor degrees, for menial jobs at fast food restaurants or whatever the case is. It was, and of course, those people were given preference because they had experience, which I had none. And having to be a father and learn my way in the world in the middle of all of this upheaval, looking at all the foreclosure signs in the neighborhoods on my street, it inherently gives you the feeling that this whole system, there's something wrong here. And like you said, I couldn't necessarily articulate it at that time, but having now witnessed the second crash within that time of my adult life, I guess, earlier this year. It breeds frustration to tell people we've got to change the system. Something's wrong here, and for people to say, well, the system's not perfect, but it's what we got, and that be the only answer.
It sounds to me almost too simplistic, but I think a lot of the upheaval in our political process, the reason that these, to use a term that I'm not a huge fan of, the reason that these culture wars are so successful at inflaming, both factions against each other is because there's this underlying economic despair, and everyone wants to tiptoe around that, because to admit that in a place like America, most people have no real hope of economic equality or even freedom in their lifetime, sort of strikes to the heart of how we view ourselves as Americans. And so nobody really wants to say that. And if you do, you'll be very quickly branded some sort of radical, fringe agitator. But the numbers don't lie. Of all the things that are very easy to quantify and look at the data and say, this is what we're seeing, economics is one of those things where data speaks and everything else is just rhetoric. And, that trend is downward every year since 1970. And
you guys, you're bumming me out. I think, give me some hope, give me some optimism, please.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's very hard. It's very hard to get involved in a political process, knowing full well that on the other end of that, no matter who is victorious in a couple of weeks, your prospects aren't going to be any better than they were.
That was not the optimism I was hoping for Gabriel.
I think most people would agree in America that none of us like to see this amount of division, and we would like to be more unified as a country. But I think the problem is not many people have articulated why, they like, people will say they like to see bipartisanship, and of course on paper, bipartisanship is two parties with opposing ideas coming together and compromising, right? And of course, most people would agree that's a beautiful thing. But what I try to tell people is when you hear the word bipartisan, be very careful, because most of the time what that means is these people who, when they're in front of the cameras and the microphones, will blame the other side, but when they're behind closed doors, they can agree just fine on things that benefit them.
Wow.
Across the board. And I know that doesn't sound optimistic, but I think if we can start articulating that with people we don't agree with and help them understand, a lot of these divisions are arbitrary. They were, provided to us, not naturally, organically, brought up. I think that you can at least start to have a conversation with the other side. And
that's a great word. I'm glad you brought it up, because built into our system is the necessity for compromise. That's how it was designed. And there have been some spectacular failures in the world of compromise over the history of our country. But it wasn't until, I would say, and others could disagree, but I would say, Ronald Reagan in 1980 and 81, where the tide began to change and compromise began to be viewed or to be sold as a bad word. Both sides, and then we see this in the 90s and the 2000s with the rise of the Tea Party, and they begin to coin terms like rhino, Republican in name only, and things like that, where there was this entrenching on both sides, at least on the public side of the house, that said, we're not going to give an inch. There won't be. And so they constantly refuse to compromise on things that are actually beneficial to us as a society. Healthcare being one of those.
Yeah, and tactics like filibustering and refusing to get anything the Democrats suggested voted through. And
But then when it's time to, for instance, go to war, we get bipartisan unity. or when it's time, to pass another $2 trillion worth of economic stimulus, the vast majority of which evaporates into the netherworld of corporate subsidies, we get some bipartisan, so I think you're absolutely right. The things that they are willing to compromise on and agree to never seem to benefit the rank and file of our society, which I think is becoming more glaringly obvious with every election cycle.
One thing that I've seen as a common thread, at least in terms of rhetoric, is you've started to see Republicans take bigger aim at the rich, which is, I find fascinating. You start to see some of this populist, that politician right there is taking corporate donations. That politician right there is voting according to the will of the pharmaceutical industry, or whatever the case is. And I know that that's not coming from a genuine place, and I know that they're not necessarily doing anything differently than that person they're accusing of doing that. But I do think that it shows at least a glimmer of hope that the class consciousness is going to become more prominent in American politics, because one of the most ridiculous things I've heard, at least on the left, is this idea that racial equality and economic equality are not the same thing, and you shouldn't bring them up in the same conversation because they are both important issues that need to be dealt with on their own. But economics is at the root of every issue that we deal with in America and the world. If somebody can't work a job and pay their bills, then what else really matters to that person in that moment, at least?
Who cares how much racial sensitivity training the person giving them their soup at the food line has received? It doesn't really seem to be addressing the problem.
I've seen some of that pushback from some people that I've made, contact with since last April, when I wrote a piece that apparently resonated with enough people. So I got a bunch of new people into my sphere of contacts that I hadn't had any contact with before. I don't know them in real life, but in exchanging ideas, and a number of them that are people of color, and they're very outspoken activists for racial equality. They say that themselves. They said we don't need these meaningless gestures. Like, there was a lot of anger amongst some activists that I know that over this whole Aunt Jemima syrup thing. They literally were saying, we don't give a damn about a syrup bottle. Yeah. Nobody asked for that, right? So
but that is a company just capitalizing on an issue for a bit of free publicity, right? Which sucks.
Yeah, it's free publicity for that company, and I think more people are beginning to see through some of these artificial constructs. When you have an entire political party caucus in our Senate, that goes through this big photo op of kneeling on the hard marble floor, and then they're wearing a very specific cultural item that they clearly know nothing about. That just sends that signal. It's an overused term, but virtue signaling is a real thing, and too many people embrace it now as a way of saying, look at me and how woke, or whatever the word of the moment is, I happen to be, without actually doing anything that makes any, this idea of Instagram activism. They're not really doing anything that makes any changes, or that make any changes that actually improve anybody's life. But they get to sleep well at night, and they have something to talk about at the next cocktail party that they attend.
That's where the conversation becomes weird. Like, I'm as disinterested in people policing old tweets as people as the other side arguing that, oh, this is virtue signaling. It's like, as you say, right, what the real conversation should come down to is, what are you doing? Like, after this photo op, what are you doing? Gabriel, let you speak.
Well, I think one of the questions that people don't ask is what is the profit motive, right? You know, whether it's the NRA and their fear mongering, or the Democrats and their fear mongering about, you know, Russian interference in our elections. What they don't ask is, what's the profit motive? What is the profit motive for a bunch of meme farms in Russia planting ads, planting information all over the place? Well, you know, I'm sure there is some interference going on there with the government, but I think in a lot of cases, all it was they were trying to sell some cheap coloring books or trying to sell some cheap, you know, items, and they were using the political discourse to do that. Whereas,
Also,
you know,
also I imagine, and we've tying a few strands together here. If you imagine what Russia's Facebook budget for messing with American agitprop is, I'm pretty sure it pales in comparison to the big American companies we were discussing earlier, right? Like, and if you
100%.
look at how many ads they'll be pushing against socialized medicine and for groups against people looking to reform American healthcare, like, I reckon that will be quite a large budget.
Yeah, they use emotional tactics and emotional rhetoric to make profit. And I think the first instinct a lot of people have is, you know, like to talk about the NRA. A lot of Republicans are scared that the Democrats are going to come in and take their guns. Well, they haven't, but you know, nobody stopped to ask, well, why are they telling us they're trying to do this when so far there hasn't been a real substantial effort to do it? Well, because they want you to buy more guns.
And that's an issue that I've grown up in the midst of, and I'm in the midst of. I mean, you know, I get a lot of flack from friends of mine and others, and then others take it as pretty much normal way of life. But I've always been a supporter of the Second Amendment, but not in the way that the NRA says they support the Second Amendment. I've never been an NRA member. I've always openly scoffed at their tactics, because that's exactly what they do. They create this climate of fear, and it leads to what we have right now. Like, if you own firearms in America right now, you know two things. Number one, you can't buy ammunition anywhere. And if you do find it, it's 2-3 times its normal price. And you can't buy guns most anywhere. And if you can find them, same story. They're 2 or 3 times their normal price. And so this is a constant cycle. As long as I've been an adult, they will whip up these frenzies, and it's just a windfall for manufacturers in that sector. And then, you know, nothing much ever happens. Those of us who think that you can have some common sense legislation around gun ownership without destroying, you know, what might be viewed as a natural right to self-defense, we laugh. These cycles are never ending, and people fall for it every time. You know, all over America, there are people sitting there that literally have basements and rooms full of ammunition that will spoil and go bad long before they ever use it, that they've spent sizable amounts of their net worth to obtain, because they are absolutely convinced that that's all that stands between them and, you know, whatever darkness is being sold to them at the moment. And it's a scam.
Well, on the flip side, you know, you have Nike producing Black Lives Matter sneakers or whatever. Meanwhile, they're made by 6-year-olds in China making 2 cents an hour. You know,
Exactly.
so I think that's where a lot of the anger comes from in America. Is we know how much artifice there is out there. We just don't know what's real, and so we cling to these you know, these bubbles, hoping to pinpoint something real.
Well, I think we're seeing, you know, there's been some talk about agendas, and I don't know if it's one big coordinated agenda. I wouldn't call it that, because then it sounds too much like a conspiracy. But we've been conditioned literally forever, as long as any one of us have been alive. We've been conditioned by advertising to know that we're being lied to and be okay with it. You know, as a child, I knew that plastic tank that I was seeing a commercial for really didn't shoot missiles and flames and things out of it, but I still wanted that plastic tank. And so you're slowly conditioned to accept, oh, it's normal that there's a gap between what you're told and what actually is. And now we've seen that, and I don't know if it's now or it's probably always been, we've seen that spill over into the areas of life that matter, our civic lives, our social structures, and our societies have become sort of this infomercial. If you look at this presidential election that's going on right now, you can clearly see people that are telling their audience whatever their audience wants to hear. And we know from experience that they're not going to follow through. Neither one of those candidates is going to follow through on what they're saying because they never have in the past. But we accept that because we're used to, we say, well, that's just the way it is. You can't expect a politician to keep their promises. They have to get elected. And I think that's one of the major pitfalls that we're trying to deal with right now, is this gap between what we're told and what reality is has gotten so large that it causes real harm. It's no longer a minor disappointment. Oh, I didn't get this or that. It's now, entire segments of our society are collapsing and being destroyed because of this gap between the rhetoric and the reality.
Yeah. And the anxiety around the uncertainty causes people to cling to things that they feel uncomfortable with. One of the things that frustrates me when I'm talking to just about anybody is, don't read that news source or don't listen to that news source because they're telling you full of lies. And what I tell them is, I listen to everything. I read everything. I don't have to agree with Breitbart's articles to read them and understand what they're saying to people or what their perspective is on the issue. The idea that we need to turn mainstream media off simply because they're lying to us. What I try to tell people is, no matter what source you're looking at, whether it's Breitbart or Project Veritas or CNN or Fox News, they will tell you the truth when it's convenient for them. And the trick is to consume as many of these sources as you can so that you can try to pick out those convenient truths that they try to use to undermine the other side or whatever it may be.
Yeah, it's when the two sides are agreeing with each other, you got to be wary.
100%.
A big 100%. Big lobbyist is in the front.
This idea of civil discourse, it sounds more appealing to people than they actually find it. It was interesting this last week. I don't know if either one of you caught this letter that was run a month or two ago. I believe Harper's ran this letter, and it was signed by hundreds of people from all walks of life: academics, entertainers, people of color, philosophers, all sorts of different. The author, it was authored and signed by many different people, and it spoke to this.
J.K. Rowling, Salman Rushdie, a bunch of scientists. Yeah.
From J.K. Rowling all the way over to Noam Chomsky on the other side. It was all over the place, and that letter generated so much pushback and so much hatred and vitriol out there in social media land because people were horrified and offended that opposing views should be given airtime, and that these people would dare to say that we should be listening to people even if we don't agree with them, or even if we're diametrically opposed to their claims, we should still listen to them. And it just struck me as sort of that was kind of a lightning rod moment in this entire ongoing debate about political and social discourse. People don't want civil discourse, and they react poorly if you suggest it. I don't mean that people came out and said, hey, I don't think their ideas were good ideas. They came out and attacked the people that signed on to that letter. You know, there were calls for all sorts of ugly repercussions against them, when in fact that letter, that was what it was speaking out against. It was saying, look, we shouldn't be hunting down, you know, social media posts from a decade ago and getting people fired because we don't like their points of view. We shouldn't be rioting on.
I could speak to the flip side of that argument, and some of the more legitimate criticisms amongst the noise. So, to give the devil their fair due, I think that came out after J.K. Rowling's particularly strange blog about how trans people are trying to sneak into changing rooms to rape women.
Yeah, well,
which was an odd one. So I can kind of like, and then the week after she was like, why can't we all get along? And you're like, because you just wrote that shitty blog.
Yeah.
So
no.
With the flip side, I do see it, but you're right. Like, I think, and also, no, I'll finish that line of thinking before we synthesize and all agree. I think the other thing as well with J.K. Rowling case specifically and the people she was defending, and I think the right often mischaracterizes the left as cancel culture trying to get fired. But what happened in this famous case in England was that it wasn't that someone got discriminated against for being transphobic. She was repeatedly being transphobic to a co-worker and dead naming her and calling her sir intentionally, right? And like they had like multiple HR meetings where they're like, could you please stop that? And then she was like, no, I won't stop. I can call people how I want. And it's like, well, it's kind of a workplace and we need to get along. So, and anyway, after like 3 attempts to say, please stop that, they eventually fired her, which I think is fair enough. And then she tried to sue the company. So it wasn't like the crazy left suing a company for being transphobic. It was a crazy transphobe suing a company for being like, sorry, but we need to all get along here. So I'll just give the devil his due on that one, why that letter got people angry. And I agree that not all of the rage was productive, but angry people on Twitter, you can find almost any cause ever. If you change the flavor of ketchup, you're going to have angry people on Twitter.
Well, yeah. Well, and therein lies one of the major pitfalls, and that is, you know, trying to reduce a complex discussion to 148 characters. You know, people are going back to what you said much earlier in the discussion. Everybody has to get that zinger in. You don't have room to add any nuances or any, you know, counterpoints. You just need to get that zinger in because you have 148 characters to do it in, or however many. I don't have a Twitter account, so I think that has contributed to a lot of sort of dumbing down of public discourse.
Well, it's trying to find, you know, and I've been guilty of this myself, right? To exalt being uncompromising, right? But the question is, on what? Are you uncompromising on policies that you feel would be necessary in this day and age, or are you uncompromising on hearing out your opponent's view on those issues? You know, and where's that line? Are you willing to compromise on policy in order to get along, or are you willing to compromise on rhetoric in order to get along? You know, and everybody has their own view of what that looks like, and it's messy.
Well, and you're exactly right. I mean, there's certainly things in my life where I'm unwilling to compromise. And, you know, a lot of those have to do with whether or not a given policy or a view or idea, you know, actually causes damage or harm to other people. And I use the word actually on purpose because one of the ways that words have been weaponized is a lot of people are claiming that they're being harmed by things that in no reasonable universe actually cause them any harm. They simply don't, they want to shut down discourse or dissent by saying, you're harming me, be quiet now. And being exposed, I'm a huge proponent of being exposed to ideas, even if you completely and categorically oppose those ideas. It's the exposure of ideas that make us re-examine our own ideas and our own views and hold them up to the light of a challenge to make sure that, you know, we've done our job to be, reasonable people with our own views. And, I was dismayed along with a lot of other people. I to begin with, I can't tell you how much I despise the Richard Spencers of the world. I have nothing good to say about that individual. But when they're invited to a university to speak and it touches off 3 or 4 days of rioting, all that does is lend credibility to the far right claims that they're being silenced because they're trying to tell the truth. Much better approach to that in my book is to let him come to that university, to stand there and speak, and let the failures of his ideas be apparent to everybody. Let the weakness of his claims be apparent to everybody. Well, when you silence somebody, now they sort of have this moral high ground where they can claim that you only wanted to shut them up because you're afraid of the truth. If you let them speak, let the whole world see, hey, this person is a fool. Their ideas are ridiculous, but they got to speak them and moving on. So, maybe I'm not in the norm on that, but I want to hear ideas, even bad ideas, and then let those bad ideas fail on their own merit. Because when we silence somebody, we automatically give them credibility that they probably don't deserve.
Right. Well, and what people don't want to accept, I think, sometimes is that you can find common ground with just about anybody. Whether you hate that person or not, there is common ground to be found. But there's this, I can't say that this has been said straight out like this, but my view of the situation is a lot of people look at finding common ground as enabling that person, and not understanding finding common ground is most likely the very first step in changing those views that you hate so much. And or at least better understanding how they reached that viewpoint and maybe offering a better counter argument than you would have before.
Yeah, and I think the big thing there is that people go too directly for their goal. So like you said, like if you find common ground with someone, maybe you can change their mind. But that shouldn't be your purpose of talking to someone. And it should be your purpose in confronting people, or not even confronting is the wrong word, meeting people with different ideas. And I found if you can just meet someone and find out they have different ideas, just enjoy that moment of hearing a different idea, because social media algorithms don't give you that. They just give you what you want to hear, what you've already heard. When someone tells you oh, here's a new story about a thing you've never heard before, it's okay to not be oh, but I heard in the news that everything you just said is wrong. And okay,
yeah,
chill out.
For instance, I was talking to a Republican one time, and I don't imagine that they were radical Republican or whatever the case is, but the idea of healthcare came up, and before I even had a chance to talk to them about what my view on healthcare was, this guy said, "Oh yeah, we should have had Medicare for all a while ago." And I was kind of stunned, really. I didn't know what to say. And he said, "Yeah, it cuts out of all the bureaucratic bloat." And it would never have occurred to me to make that as an argument to a conservative audience had I not had that conversation.
Yeah, and it's an issue we're told we're divided on, so we assumed we are, right?
Right. And yeah, so there are a number of Republicans who would favor a Medicare for all system, but we won't know that if we don't start talking to them.
Yeah, and likewise, their news will be telling them that you're in favor of communist healthcare, the worst system ever.
Going back to what you were just saying about ideas and hearing each other out and finding that common ground to sort of stand on, to work from. I don't know if either one of you ran across or remember from a couple of years ago the story of Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis is an interesting man. He's a blues musician. He's a black man, and he spent a good portion of his life befriending members of the KKK. And over that time period, he has convinced over 200 Klans members to give up, membership in the Klan simply by befriending them and having conversations. That's it. And I can't think of two ideological positions that are more opposed to each other than a black blues musician and a member of the KKK. But that willingness to sit down and have conversation, I'm certain that those conversations didn't happen because, Mr. Davis came out right away with saying, "Hey, I'm going to get you to quit the Klan." It was simply, whatever. I don't know how it happened, but I can imagine, along the lines of talking about things that they might have in common or things that they both liked, or even if those were trivial things like a brand of beer or an automobile or, a piece of music or whatever, and then building on that rapport into, heavier subject matter. It was an interesting story to me because if those two diametrically opposed demographics can become friends and it leads to real and positive changes, why can't everybody do that? I guess I don't see. Certainly the will has to be there, and that's the big separator. But I don't believe people when they say, "Hey, I will never sit down at a table with people like that." Whatever their target demographic is,
Yeah.
I'll never sit
often,
down at a table.
It's often people that never have, right? So,
Yeah.
I often had an interesting chat with some people from Colorado, and they're very anti-feminist. And I said, well, look, I don't want to get into it because I'm not an expert on the subject, but I imagine if you spoke to an intelligent feminist, you would be surprised to hear that she's not the demon witch you imagine them all to be. And she might have some interesting points. And all you think about, but what about men's rights? Like most intelligent feminists I've spoke to are all about that too. Like they get the argument.
Well, it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what the opposing viewpoint is. If like you said, there's even among feminists, there are different views on what that means. Even among, one of the things I've noticed with, especially the election, is people seem to think that Black voters all think the same and do the same things, and but no, there's a lot of individuality, complete individuality there, and one person may vote for this person, and one person may vote for another person, but it's refusing to accept the idea that even in that viewpoint you oppose, there is a variation.
I'd be interested to dig down, Gabriel, on your time in sort of the Democrat Party and dealing with opposing views, and how hopeful you are now, like to try and reform that from the inside.
Well, so I mean, it's my view on that has flipped back and forth throughout the years, but one of the things that I found really frustrating is going to these local meetings, whether it's my county or whether it's the state meetings. For a time I was on the various committees within the Democratic Party, and 99% of the time is not spent talking about issues or our agenda or our policy goals. It's about who's in charge. It's about let's move that comma over here. That's a good change. We worked really hard on that. What I've found frustrating with Democrats is a lot of them seem to understand that the Democratic Party is not as left as it claims to be or presents itself as, but they present that as a necessary evil because there are reasonable Republicans out there who can see our point of view. And on paper, sure, I can understand that thinking, but what I've tried to tell Democrats is we need to stop trying to package moderate conservative ideas to Democrats, and we need to start packaging leftist democratic socialist ideas to moderate Republicans, because they can be receptive to those. As I mentioned before, there are Republicans who think that we need socialized healthcare in America.
I would recommend rebranding it, but yes.
Yeah. And I think that it's possible to reform the Democratic Party and to make it more inclusive of democratic socialist ideas. The problem is you have a lot of leftists who think it's beyond repair and we need to start something new. And then you have other Democrats who are convinced that we can save the party and reform it. If either of those camps decided to join up and enact their particular strategy, I think it would work. But the idea that third party politics is a dead end is kind of feeding itself. They tell me, yeah, we could or we should have a third party that represents true leftist ideas, but our system's just not designed that way. And what I always want to ask them is, well, what was there before that system? Everybody thinks that something is going to stay the way it's always been until it's not. And whether that's just natural evolution of circumstances or whether a bunch of people just got together and decided enough was enough. I think the biggest problem is people think they don't have the power to make these sorts of changes. And I hate to say it, but when you're the only one saying that we need to make those changes and everybody's telling you, yeah, I totally agree with you, but I just don't think it's possible.
Is part of the problem the obsession with voting? Because I think the interesting thing of this topic, right, is that we're talking politics, and so much of it hasn't been about the act of voting, which is once every 4 years, right? It's about having conversations with people you agree with and having more open and interesting conversations, having conversations with people you disagree with, maybe getting involved in local government or, the bigger parties. I do worry that that's part of the problem, is that people think that politics is something that happens once every 4 years and then they just forget about it for the rest of the time.
Well, yeah. I mean, what I can tell you, trying to reform the Democratic Party in the years in between elections is very lonely because, like you said, people pop up once that general elections, starts heating up. But in the years in between, when you're trying to talk to Democratic Party officials and people who are involved throughout the years, they just tell you that now's not the time. We can work on this when the election comes along. And then when the election comes along, they say now's not the time. We need to focus on that after the election's over. And when it comes to voting, I think there's a lot of people don't have faith in the act of voting because, as we've talked about over the conversation, they don't necessarily see a substantial difference between the people they're voting for. But there's a disconnect too, because when the George Floyd protests popped up and you started to see a lot of corporate or institutional admitting for maybe the first time that there is institutional racism we need to address. That was progress. And that was progress that was not brought about in a voting booth. That was people taking to the streets, making their anger and their discontent known. And, I find it interesting when people who are involved in politics on a granular level, on the local level, they talk badly about people who they view as armchair activists, people who just seem to tweet out things. But I don't know if you've observed this. There's been plenty of instances where a whole lot of angry tweets got a company to change a policy that had been in place for a long time. Whereas government regulation seems to take decades to make that company make that same exact change. So, yeah, I think there's a question over how effective the voting system is.
Well, I think I think a valid criticism of the voting system is the gap between people who feel strongly about an issue and people who actually show up to vote. We don't have what I would consider to be even reasonable voter turnout typically for either any part of our election cycle. So there are generally elections every year from local level issues all the way up to national elections every 2 to 4 years. And one of the things that so many people overlook is you're going to have the biggest impact. Your vote is going to cause the biggest splash, so to speak, on local level issues, those off-year election cycles, but they don't show up. We barely get, in recent elections, we've started to get into the 60% range during a presidential election year, but during an off year, you're lucky if you get 40% voter turnout on those issues that have the most direct effect on people in your community. People just don't bother to make their voice heard, and then they turn around and they say, well, voting doesn't work. And my knee-jerk response to that is, well, how do we know voting doesn't work? Because we don't really do it. There's a lot of sound and fury, like you said, every 4 years. But then when it comes time to cast those ballots, 60%,
Yeah.
64%, at 64%, I think was considered great. That was like everybody applauded a 64% voter turnout, which means, if you want to do simplified math, for what it's worth, 64% of the people turned up and you had two major candidates, which means somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 34% of the people in this registered voters in this country chose the president.
Yeah, and the other way of stating that is that the most popular choice was none of the above.
Yeah,
that won the popular vote, right?
Yeah, exactly.
People that stayed at home.
Yeah. So that the president of this country is usually selected by such a small minority of the people in this country that it's very easy to grow disaffected with the system and feel like it doesn't really matter. The same 30% or so is making all of the decisions, and money is driving those decisions. This sort of unfettered cash flow into our political process, following Citizens United decision and some other decisions that sort of opened the floodgate, has made the common voter feel even more isolated from the process. I mean, look at the money that's being spent on this presidential election, and then try to explain to a guy who's making, or a person who's making, $30K a year, trying to make their rent and keep their heat on during the winter months, that somehow these people have their best interest in mind. When hundreds of millions of dollars, and even over, I don't know what the tally is right now, but from the numbers that are being raised by both candidates right now, it looks to me like running for president now costs over $1 billion.
Yeah, and most people don't understand that the politicians who most affect their daily lives, I would argue, are their mayors, their city councilors, or county commissioners, who, if people were paying attention, the vote wouldn't necessarily, it wouldn't be as big of a hurdle to jump over to get the person you want elected in those particular races. But people aren't told that that's a priority, or people aren't told that that has an impact on their daily lives.
Yeah, and if you look at like the psychology of like despair, hopelessness, thinking too big, right? Like it's just a recipe for disaster. So you can have much more agency and control over your surroundings if you don't try and be one of those, however many million voting once every 4 years in some big nebulous thing. But I'd recommend everyone get involved in local politics. And I'm not one of those people that is just doing that because I hope my side wins if more people vote. I genuinely think everyone should get more involved. And I think diversity of thought and opinion will make those local elections better. And I think if a lot of people went to a town hall and saw how bad some of those officials were, they'd probably be more interested in getting a job in politics themselves.
Right. And there's probably more common ground to be found on the local level anyway, because when you're talking about these huge issues like immigration or, these national issues, it's easy to jump to that quick conclusion. It's easy to find that quick argument and
easy to get tribalistic. Yeah.
Yeah. But when you're talking about, do you want that oil refinery right by the river that runs through your town? I think there's going to be, of course, you're going to have some disagreements there too, but I think that you'll find a little bit more common ground in situations.
The guy in the top hat, like with a barrel of oil.
Yeah.
I think it's a great idea.
Well, and this is, it really strikes to the heart of the matter. And local, people have become accustomed to viewing our political process sort of in a top-down model, when in effect it should be, and was designed to be, a bottom-up model. The closest elected officials to you have the greatest impact on everything. Like take school boards, for instance. That's probably one of the lowest barriers to entry into an elected position, is to run for school board. Historically, school boards were some of the first place that women were allowed to be elected to school boards. That is literally probably the lowest rung of elected political positions. But look at the impact that a school board can have, both in the sorts of curriculum that they adopt and the supports that they put in place for teachers. And each one of those teachers, obviously this is something near and dear to my heart, but those teachers are coming into contact with how many different people that are now growing up and voting. It's not hard to make a solid case for, people focusing closer to home. And then those ideas that they feel are worthy, those will percolate up over time.
And not just the ideas, right? The people too. People forget politicians don't grow on trees. So if you're supporting a young candidate for change, right, today, and then that helps their political career get started, that they will end up, as often happens, right, moving up. Let's see how far those ideas take them.
And they'll take all of those local ideas with them as they climb the political ladder, so to speak. And they will take the support, of Main Street USA, to use an overused term, with them as they climb the ladder. When we come at it from this top-down approach, we are literally abdicating, to the big corporate interests in our society. The kind of money that has made themselves unassailable to us, the commoners, so to speak, are now dictating what sort of values and policies should be adopted in our political process, versus having people take these local grassroots ideas up the ladder with them over the course of their political career.
And people I think there's a lot of apathy around incremental change on national politics, but as we've said, on the local level, there's a lot more room for more quick changes to be made, which in turn, I'd imagine, motivates people to do even more and go from there.
Well, how empowering is it to a young voter, or even an old voter for that matter, to see what you want happen right in front of your eyes? Even if it's on a relatively minor issue, to see that, hey, I've got drainage issues on the street in my neighborhood. It floods every time it rains, and it rains all the time around here. So I go to the city council, I don't get the response that I want. So I get involved in the process, and a candidate assures me that they're going to listen to our, needs, and we elect them, and the next thing you know, my drainage issues on my street are being addressed. I mean, that's a real superficial example, but now you're seeing the process in action. And you're saying, well, I took some actions and I did some things and I got a result back that it was beneficial to me and the people in my neighborhood. Now I can see how this should be working, and then expand out from there.
Yeah, and going to those meetings, I went to a city council meeting a couple of years ago, and one of the items they were talking about was building a car dealership out on one of the public lands that everybody around here knows Dinosaur Ridge. It's one of our small little treasures that we have, and they wanted to build a car dealership right next to it, and spoil the land there. And there were only two people in that meeting other than myself. And one of those people was he worked for the company that wanted to develop this car dealership. And from what I could gather, he had been going to every single town or city council meeting since that project started. And they weren't giving him what he wanted, but you could see that there was that sort of rapport, like, there's Jake again. He's back again. And over time, they're going to start to hear what he's saying just because they're familiar with him. And meanwhile, there's nobody else in this meeting to challenge what he's saying and provide an alternative viewpoint. And most people won't even know that this whole process is happening right under their noses.
But they will all notice when that car dealership goes in on that public land, and they lose access to it.
And they'll write an angry tweet about it.
There'll be lots of fist shaking at that point, but
I think we found some optimism, guys. Well done.
I think so. Well, and to add even further, they're eventually using that story as an example. Eventually, the wider community did get wind of what was happening, and they had a packed meeting not long after the one I attended, and of course the city council, they totally nixed the idea of building that dealership. So there are moments where the community can come together and accomplish something real.
The trick is to make those moments be the norm rather than the exception. And
exactly.
We talked earlier about this idea of economic exceptionalism, if you want to use that term, where we point to that one occasional person that makes it out of abject poverty into the lofty heights of wealth and privilege and fame and fortune, and how those exceptions are held up as examples to why we should all continue to adhere to this sort of outdated economic policy. It's interesting. I think that we need to abandon those ideas in the economic realm. I think we need to adopt those ideas in the political realm. And I don't think those two realms are exclusive of each other. But as far as making political action happen, I think we should be pointing to those exceptions and saying, look, here is a glimpse of the possibilities. If we want this, we can actually get this, rather than simply throwing our hands up in the air. I think you're right about social media. It does facilitate some positive changes. Whether or not those positive changes outweigh a lot of the negatives, that's a personal opinion that everybody is going to have a view on. But I think we should be trumpeting these local examples of how the political process works to sort of get people, if I can use the term, sort of prime the pump. Get people, because people are so cynical right now. I mean, cynicism has almost reached a religious level in this country when it comes to politics.
But they're right to be. Your odds of changing the world when you're one of millions of people and you get one vote every 4 years, that is legitimate cynicism. But everyone wants to change the world, but it starts in your backyard, right?
Right. I mean, if your world does change when your backyard changes. Most people, I mean, that was something I was going to comment on a minute ago or a while ago. I think the conversation moved on from there, but this idea of, I've begun to toy with the idea that at the upper levels of our political process and our corporate process, so our economic and political processes at the upper level, they have embraced globalism. But down at the rank and file American citizen level, the rank and file people in the street are largely still isolationists. And so the people at the top of the process, whether it be economics or politics, are making moves on a global scale, while the people at the bottom of the process can't understand why they always seem to be coming out on the short end of the deal, because they are still viewing the world through an isolationist lens. So many Americans never travel abroad in their entire lifetime. So many Americans, and this goes back to what you were talking about with medicine. So many Americans accept this fact that European style, social medicine is a complete disaster because they've never been there to see for themselves. They only know what they've been told.
The challenge is, if you ever go to Europe, find a European that wants to swap for the American system.
Yeah. And that's exactly it. Because Americans are sort of stuck in this isolationist world, where their view of the world is fed to them. That it's not something that most of Americans go out and see with their own eyes or experience for themselves. I think that if you shipped every American to some place in the world, like a Scandinavian country or a European country that has a robust healthcare system, and let them experience that healthcare system for 6 months or a year, you wouldn't even have a debate in this country about healthcare anymore. Everybody would come home and say, "That's what we want. Let's do that."
We would challenge that schizophrenic view that America is the greatest country in the world, but we can't even accomplish what little old Sweden does.
Yeah, and if you happen to get sick tomorrow, you'll be bankrupt, and everything that you've worked so hard to get, all of the pieces that show that you're somehow winning at the game of capitalism, will disappear in the blink of an eye, because you got sick, or because you were injured, or some other health issue came up. And so until Americans can broaden their horizon, I think it becomes extremely hard. And that's why maybe there's merit to this idea of saying, all right, look, if you're not gonna take into account the whole world and how things actually work, then just focus on your own neighborhood. Make that a better place. If that's
and as we've been alluding to, if you work on a project and you and the other person help stop them building that car garage or whatever in your park, and then you find out later that guy has different political views from you, but that was okay, and you still got something done together. That'd be quite an important moment for people to have.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, people need to see things in action before they really believe it. And even then, a lot of times, as we can see, they have a hard time accepting what they're actually seeing versus what they're being told. And I think message frequency has a lot to do with that. If you are bombarded with messages that the world works a certain way, and you only occasionally see that might not be true, you're still going to believe the rhetoric over the reality.
Okay, well, let's keep having those conversations. Any closing thoughts? Anything you guys want to promote or recommend?
Well, there is a book or an author. If he's a favorite of mine, I ran into him, but I don't know if either one of you are familiar with James Howard Kunstler. He writes primarily from a viewpoint of, you might label him a new urbanist, but he writes primarily from a viewpoint of how public space is designed and how it's meant to function, and what it does to people's psyche and what it does to people's civic engagement and everything else. And I found, so he's kind of an irreverent writer, but he wrote a book called Home from Nowhere a while back, and he runs a he runs a blog which, if you know him, makes perfect sense. The name of his blog is Clusterfuck Nation. He has a lot of what I think are very valuable insights about why we feel the way we feel, why we behave the way we behave, why our society is interacting, or more accurately, not interacting the way that it is. And it revolves around the design and function of our towns and cities, our architecture, the layout of suburbs versus, more traditional European city models, and so on. I found it very fascinating, and I think it comes at a lot of the issues we've been discussing from such a fresh approach, that it really, sort of gives you a lot of different things to think about when we're trying to quantify the complexity of this issue of, how can we all just get along, for lack of a better way of putting it. He feels that architecture and urban design plays a huge role in that, and I think he makes his point very well.
Thank you very much. I'll be sure to check that out. Gabriel, what would you like to recommend?
Sure. Yeah, no, I don't really have anything to promote, but I think this might be helpful for people to hear how I approach conversations with people that I might not see eye to eye with. One of the things I try to keep centered in my mind at all times when I'm having a conversation that could possibly be contentious is the person I'm talking to wants to live a fulfilling life. They want to feel a sense of purpose. They want to provide for themselves and their families, and do more than just be quote unquote cog in the system. Everybody that I talk to, 9 times out of 10, maybe there's that one anarchist out there, but they want to feel those things. So I try to work from that point forward. And obviously what that looks like to people is different depending on who you're talking to. But if you can start from that point, understanding this person wants those things just like I do, then you can start to find out where that meets. And then once you get to those divergence points, you've already established that basic agreement between people, and help understand that they are people who have feelings and wants and needs just like you do. And automatically having a more humanistic viewpoint of that person is going to lead to a more productive conversation most of the time. If you can't, then you can disengage from there. But I think doing that first is always worth a try.
Much, gentlemen. I really enjoyed that. That went even better than I was anticipating.
I appreciate it.
Well, Thank you very much. Like I said at the beginning, this was something new for me. So
Yeah, what I really liked was actually the dropping in late as I did. So you guys are just talking, and then like the podcast never started, and yet it just started. It was lovely.
That was great. I had a great conversation. I enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'll probably try and edit this this weekend because I'm busy, so I like to move quick on stuff. And then yeah, I'll share a link so that whatever podcast thing you hear, it'll be everywhere. Do you want me to do your names, or would you like to be anonymous, or just your first name? How would you like it?
I'm okay with you using my name if you want to, or however you'd like to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, same here. Yeah.
Okay, and if you want me to link to a Twitter or a Facebook or anything, let me know. Just I found that book, I think, so I'll link to that. And yeah, let me know if you think of anything you want me to link to in the show notes. Okay.
I just sent over the name of that, JHK, and I mean, like I said, it was a book I really enjoyed. I think everybody ought to give it a look.
I will check it out. Thank you very much.
Well, I definitely appreciated the opportunity too, so thank you for that and the invitation.
Yeah. Like as you said, like I found you both random Facebook groups. I don't even know how I found you both. But I added two strangers, and yeah, this went as I say, even better than I thought it would, because you've both been sharing really interesting things. So thank you so much for that. Take care. I hope you're both well, and good luck with the election, and good luck with getting healthcare.
Thank you.
Or relocating to somewhere where y'all have healthcare already.
You'll always be welcome. You can California or Colorado, our countries anytime. You're very welcome to.
All right. Well, you guys take care.
Cheers, all the best.
Thank you.